I've been in IT since I was 14 years old. I tried to get out, but it pulled me back in. Quote line. The only time that I did have a gap where I wasn't full IT, this shows you the infinite wisdom of the military and the personnel system. So those of you that are former military can appreciate this. I graduated from Citadel. I was number one in my class in physics. My number one slot on my wish list was to go to a physics program. Any of the laboratories would have been great. To add to that, I graduated with a BS in physics, and at the time Citadel actually offered a BA in mathematics, which was strange because it was BA in mathematics, natural sciences. So figure that one out. The Air Force's infinite wisdom said, okay, we're going to make you a computer programmer because you've been a computer programmer since you were 14, but officers aren't programming anymore. So you're just going to go to a slot that has a computer programmer tag, which happens to be a project manager for computer contracts. The number 2 graduate from the Citadel went to physics laboratory. So for about 2 months, I argued with my boss and said, look, you've got to give me something technical because I can't stand project management. Although you are going to actually use me as a project manager, and that's how I got into the web, because at that time, it was 1995, and it was just starting to blossom. Before we started learning about things like firewalls and web server security and all that other stuff. And it was when we first started trying to do online ordering. Well, fast forward about a year and a half, and we have online ordering for the Air Force. And our major, the promoted lieutenant colonel, calls me and another guy in, who is now a senior .NET architect at whatever FlexJet got renamed. So you know about Uber and all those. So Learjet used to have something called FlexJet, which is basically if you don't have the money to buy your own Learjet, you can rent one. That's what FlexJet did. So that's where he works now. They called us in and they said, okay, we want to test the security of our online processing system. Can you guys see if you can hack in? And we're like, yeah, why not? You know, we said Windows NT4, Sybase database, custom coded front end that they were running clients connecting to the back end database. So the first thing we do is like, well, server's on the network. Let's see if we can test the server. All right, let's try administrator. Okay, let's try password. No, that didn't work. Okay, so what's the second choice? Drowsat, right? That's password backwards. That didn't work. And so I looked over at my friend Chad, and I said, well, what do you want to bet they didn't put a password on the system? And he's like, surely they couldn't have password. It's an Air Force system. They've got to have a password. Administrator, enter. And we're in. And that was my first real introduction to how poorly systems can be secured. So over the course of the time since 95, 96, been a web developer, DBA, Active Directory architect, and just about anything on the Windows and network security side. And so currently, I give another presentation which is talks about how I've bounced around and how that helps me, because it allows me to see basically more of the big picture of the architecture. So those of you that are architecture, those of you that are full stack, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When you talk to folks that only work on the front end and the user interface, and you start talking about back end stuff, and their eyes glaze over, and you're like, you guys need to understand this because you're killing me performance-wise, right? Or if you deal with guys who want to do the back end, and they're like, I don't care what the front end looks like, and you know what the users do, and they're going to scream that this doesn't work right, you get what I'm saying. I keep bouncing around between being a senior DBA and a DBA architect and being an Active Directory and security architect. So currently, I'm back in my day job as an Active Directory and security architect, but I still consult along the database security side. So what I'm going to talk about today is architectural concepts. I'm not going to go into specifics on any major project, on any particular platform or anything of that sort, because I don't think that's helpful, because there's I mean, there's a lot of similarities with what you guys are doing, but there are some differences as well. And so, with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So, I called it 3 things in 3 places because there are 3 things that I'm worried about, and there are 3 places that we can apply that to. And I'm using that rather generally. So, if you don't know me, my name is Brian Kelly. As I was telling someone, I'm a graduate of Citadel, class of 1995. Don't hold that against me if you're not a fan of Citadel. We do some stupid things constantly. It's the nature of the school and the military. This is the kind of, if you want to know everything you want to know, yes, I am actually a certified information systems auditor. Are there any auditors in here? No. Oh, you're an auditor? Are you a certified auditor?
I was a PCIQ state for 10 years.
Okay. So have you ever looked at the ISAC, ICIS?
Yeah, I just decided I didn't want any more tests.
You know what? I strongly encourage you to take this test because of the story I'm going to tell you. So how many of you have ever dealt with auditors and walked away going, what the heck did they just ask me for?
So I actually wrote the audits up for Professor Waterhouse for back in the 80s. So.
Yeah. And so sometimes you're like, what does that have to do with the cost of coffee, right? So my current organization, we decided, probably about 10 years ago, well, 7 years ago, I think it is now, to set up an alternate data location so that we have a warm standby site because we have 20-something organizations that own us. We're a co-op. And their stuff can't go down because they're in states all throughout the Southeast, including Puerto Rico, provided freedom for survives. So one of the internal auditors in my organization encouraged me to try to become a certified information systems auditor. Because if you do disaster recovery, if you do any kind of operational planning, data center security, not even necessarily any audit, with 3 years experience and passing 1 test, you get that nice new certification added to tagline. So it's a $250, at that time it was a $250 test. I think it's like $400 now. It's a really expensive test. It's right on the line to CISSP. And I was doing some of the study questions because that's all the time I had to do because we were so busy building that new data center. We were working 16-hour days, and for the 5 weeks out from the test, the first 3 weeks, I was always at that alternate data location. So I wasn't even at home. Like I said, we were working freezing data center because they didn't have adequate facilities, so we were literally sitting next to our racks, the air conditioning, the air blowing straight on us. If you've ever been in a data center that has really good air systems, you get really, really cold fast. We would leave to go get hot chocolate every hour because otherwise our fingers started turning cold. So needless to say, there was no time to study. So get back, and there's all the stuff that's left over at work, and don't study at all, except for maybe 4 hours the Friday before the Saturday test. We get to the Saturday test, and they hand me a Scantron form. So just think about this. This is an IT auditor test, and they hand you a Scantron. How many of you have taken certification tests? Almost always on the computer somewhere, right? But not these guys, and they're still Scantrons. They still ask you to bring 2 number 2 pencils. So went to go take the test, and it's supposed to be a 4-hour test. And after an hour, I'm done. And so I'm thinking, okay, I so don't know the material that I don't even know I don't know the material. That's why I'm done before everyone else. And I turn in my stuff, and I leave, and I'm thinking, well, that was $250 I just flushed down the toilet, I guess. And at the time, well, it's even now, you can only take it twice a year. You can only take the CISA test twice a year. So I go and I tell the internal auditor, I say, you know what, I think I totally flubbed it. I was out in an hour, and no one else looked even close to being done. And then you have to wait 6 weeks to get your scores because, of course, it's a Scantron, right? It means I've got to get it and scan it in. It's just maddening. I'm used to the Microsoft certification test, Security Plus, and all those where you take it on there, instant gratification, you either pass or you fail. It's shown right there on the screen. And I get the scores back, and it says, you pass. And I show it to the internal auditor that I was working with, and she went, that's the highest score I've ever seen. And I went, you got to be kidding me. Like, I didn't even study for the stupid test. How's the highest score I've seen? It's the highest score I've ever seen. Okay, whatever. And then I did a calculation. So most certification tests, you have to score somewhere 85%, somewhere in that range. There's a variance, 5 to 7%, depending on the test and what they see in scores. I did the calculation, passing score for that year. Now, keep in mind, it's like the SAT and the ACT. You do get points for putting your name on the test right off the bat. So even with that in mind, passing score for the CISA that year was about 40%. You made it 40% or higher, you passed, and you were a certified information systems auditor. So if you ever wonder why auditors ask questions that don't seem to make any sense, even though they bear all these titles, that should give you a little insight. I tell that because the reason I tell that is that when you deal with auditors, and some of the stuff that we'll talk about, auditors may ask about, they probably won't because they won't even know to. Don't just give them what they want, ask them what they actually need, because if you don't do that, they're just going to show up and bother you again, which is more wasted time than if you're agile, that means rework. So, here's my contact information, I'll have it at the end as well. I am active on Twitter. The one thing people get tripped up on is my family uses the EY spelling of Kelly. And so if you do K-Bine Kelly without the EY, obviously you won't get to me. I do blog occasionally on infrastructure security issues at True Solutions. And then the personal development, that's GKK goalkeeping, because I used to be a goalkeeper of soccer. Like getting soccer balls kicked in my head. So it's a play on words. So what are my goals for you guys today? Because I think that's good for any kind of presentation. Here's the three that I want you to get out of today. Okay, first is I want to get you in an adversary mindset. How many of you participate in penetration testing in your own systems? Very good. So this will be something that you probably haven't had much experience with for the most of you, being the attacker, being the bad guy. Playing the bad guy is fun. I want you to think about areas that are traditionally neglected, because these are the areas that scare me the most as a security architect, because I can go into almost every organization that I've ever dealt with, to include the U.S. military, and realize that what I'm talking about today isn't protected. And I'm not here to scare you, but I'm here to bring visibility on it, because the reality is the reason these areas aren't protected is we don't have very good solutions to protect them. Now, who traditionally builds solutions? Developers, right? Which is one of the reasons why I chose this call. And I also want you to understand the insider threat. And I put insider in quotes because it used to be, they said, about 10 years ago, banks said about 60% of security incidents within banks were from an insider threat. And that meant someone going bad or someone who was hired who was bad. Nowadays, when we say insider, we actually mean someone who has privileged credentials of some sort, and that's not necessarily somebody who works for you. And I'll explain that. So, how I'm going to hopefully accomplish those goals is with this agenda. InfoSec is the way NSA does information security. If you have a Cisco, if you look at Cisco certifications, you'll see InfoSec written just like that. We'll talk about the insider threat, we'll talk about those three things in three places, and we'll talk about applying them and also look at two examples that will, I think, be applicable to what you guys do. So, how many of you have ever seen this? Okay, one guy, he's a security guy in the back. So this is what we call the CIA triad in information security. It has nothing to do with the Central Intelligence Agency. It has everything to do with these words. Now, if you're like me, as a security guy, you focus on confidentiality and integrity. And most of the time, when you're dealing with developers, you kind of gloss over that availability portion. But the reality is all three words are important for information security. So let's talk about what they are. Confidentiality is only the right people seeing the data. But it actually goes a step beyond that. It's only the right people seeing the data with authorized programs and processes. So let me give you a great example. My background in databases is primarily SQL Server. The bane of our existence is when we give an end user read access to tables in the transactional system, and they attach Microsoft Access to it. Because that can block that transactional table, and then nothing happens. True story, actually happened on one of our loan rate lock systems, where someone was originating a loan, trying to get the interest rate for the loan, and for an hour and a half, they couldn't do any interest rate locks. because the table that it's write to was locked. Now, no one could figure out why on the business side. For an hour and a half, they're all scrambling. They finally talked to IT, and about 5 minutes ago, oh, so-and-so is running, or so-and-so's got access and they got attached, da-da-da. So we would say in this particular case that access is not an approved application. He has access, but he doesn't have to do an approved application. He should never have been attaching via access. He has that because he was supposed to use Excel and pull queries in and have the data in static format. Because access can actually put what we call relots on a backend table, and then you can't write to it, which sucks if you have a transactional system where people are actually trying to do business. Integrity is like confidentiality, except as opposed to reading data, it's changing data, adding, updating, deleting. Again, authorized people, authorized processes and programs. Now availability, that's the one on security types tend to gloss over, and when we do, beat us over the head and remind us about this because we're so focused on CI that we forget A is important. A says the system is available and the user is able to do what he or she needs to do in order to do the job. So if we lock the system down so tight that they can't do the job, then what good's the system? What good's all that development effort? What good's all that requirements gathering? What good's all that testing? If you've been in stand-up meetings and going through all that, and you've been doing this, and this has been sprint after sprint after sprint, and all of a sudden, security guy goes crank, and all of a sudden, you can't get access to your back-end web servers that provide the information that your front-end web servers need. Your application is screwed. And whose fault is it? Well, who are they going to blame first? Always the guys who see the most, right? So you don't know that the security guys type account. So if we do something like that, let us know. This is the basis of what I'm going to talk about with regards to how we're going to secure things. Also, that leads to this principle. How many have seen this principle before? Right? It's a fairly simple one. It's basically, you give them the permissions to do the job. Nothing more, nothing less. Anything more threatens C and I. Anything less, obviously, threatens A. The tendency isn't to err here. The tendency is to err here. For instance, make administrators of everybody on their boxes, right? Works great until cryptoware comes in. And all of a sudden, that workstation is scrapped. There's another reason that we're worried about that. And that's the insider threat. So when we talk about security, security guys, we don't distrust the majority of folks in our organization. We realize that well over 99% of people aren't going to mess things up, not intentionally. There's honest mistakes, there's misprocedures and training issues, but they're not going to cause problems. And when we talk, oftentimes when we talk to developers, though, we don't do a good job conveying that we understand that. It seems like we think everybody but us is out to get the organization. I know because I have been accused of that myself. But sometimes you have bad people. You hire someone in and you don't realize that they have the ethics of some super villain. And if they can abscond with personal data that they can sell on the black market, they will sell you out, move on, and hope you don't catch on. There's also cases where sometimes people turn bad. I'll give you a great example from a few years ago. So I'm a DBA, and DBA, we consider ourselves pretty trustworthy. We have to be for the job that we do. But a few years ago, Citibank basically prosecuted a DBA for going into their systems, taking valid credit code numbers with the PIN codes, and selling them. This guy had been a model employee for a number of years. What changed?
Health insurance, didn't get a raise.
Divorce plus new alimony payment. Suddenly, he didn't have enough money to live and pay alimony. So what does he do? He panics, and what was a guy who would never have considered this in the past, because his entire life is shattered, crosses over to the dark side. Well, that's not as likely, though, as this one. Adversary acting like an insider. And if you think about it, that happens a lot. I have people that tell me, oh, but so-and-so, and I always say Miss Emma, because Miss Emma is a nice other name. When you think of Miss Emma, you think of this little old lady who's sitting there, and she wouldn't harm a fly. She's the one who brings cookies in and everything else, right? So Miss Emma may be the purest soul you have ever met in your life. There's never been someone as good as Miss Emma ever walked the earth. You know she would never do anything to compromise the system. But somebody gave her too many permissions. And Miss Emma, being a trusting soul that she is, gets this nice little email that says, hey, your online order is ready. To review it, click here. Does that sound familiar? The reason it sounds familiar is because that attack happened last week. There is a particular set of rootkits and malware kits known as Angler. If you search for it, you'll find it. It is the bane of IT security right now, one of them, right? And these guys did a massive spam campaign that beat most systems for a while, including Proofpoint and all the major vendors. They got through to a ton of enterprises, including mine. We saw it. It's like, your online order is ready from Zoe's Kitchen. I'm thinking, okay, I didn't order from Zoe's Kitchen. I couldn't possibly have placed that. But you know what? What we found is some of our users actually forward that email to their personal email systems. And some of them actually clicked the link. Now, thankfully, by the time it got to us, our spam provider had already detected it and flagged it as malware, leading to a malware link and prevented it. But if someone clicks on it, it's brand new. Maybe it's a spear phishing attack. Maybe it goes to your CIO, who, despite the fact that he's supposed to be your chief information security officer, you know he's been out of the core front lines for too many years. And so he sees something and goes, click. And now he's compromised. But because he's the CIO, you've given him read access to just about every database and creation, and just about every information system that you've got. And a Trojan gets installed on the system. Now what happens? Now the attacker functions as him. What happened in South Carolina Department of Revenue? How many of you got affected by that? I did. Yeah. And so I'm worried. So they told us that it's not just us that we have to worry about, it's our kids, right? Because what happens is we have to look at their credit scores too, because attackers know that you don't review those. What about Anthem? You guys hear about Anthem? It's like Blue Cross Blue Shield. You know who actually spotted the data breach in Anthem? DBA. He's sitting there monitoring one of the database servers. He's like, oh, someone's running a really heavy query. Man, that's really taxing the system. That's me. But I'm not running that query. IT security, sir, we've got a problem, right? It's a healthcare provider. About 5-6 years ago, the attacks against defense contractors, they actually compromised RSA so they could get the RSA tokens because they couldn't beat the web system, they couldn't beat the web servers. So what they said is, if I can't beat the security on the web servers, we'll compromise their identities. How are they getting access? Yeah. See, they broke in RSA, stole the algorithms that generate the tokens, and all they had to do was find out what token is assigned each person. Now the two-factor authentication doesn't work, or it doesn't protect. It works just fine, but not for the attacker. Attackers went after Google and other agencies as well, right? So from an IT security perspective, I always assume that a user account, including mine, is going to be compromised. And that's a general rule that I would strongly encourage you to assume as well. So if you ever get told, hey, you have to have a regular account, a privileged account, how many of you guys have that in your work environment? Regular account, privileged account. If you do a PCI compliance, and you're like me and you're an IT security architect, AD administrator, you're actually supposed to have 4 different accounts for every Windows domain. Your regular account, your domain admin account, a server admin account, and if you have administration of the workstations, a workstation admin account. Because if I compromise any one of those, then I can actually basically spiderweb across to other core systems. So if I compromise a workstation account, then at least I can't get the servers, right? But the reason we do that is that we assume that accounts are going to be compromised. So think about this. If someone were able to compromise your current account today, what could they do? Could they get access to source control? Yeah. So from the industry, that happened. And it impacted a lot of gamers. How many of you play Half-Life 2?
Same stuff.
Yeah, so one of the core developers of Half-Life 2 had malware specifically targeted for him. The guy that wrote it ran it against all the antivirus things, finally submitted the virus total, nothing checked out. Sent it to the guy. Developer, thinking it was legitimate, opened it up, nothing happened. He didn't think anything about it. That guy, that attacker, adversary, just wanted to see how the ending of Half-Life 2 was going to be. So he goes and he logs in because the Trojan is now on the developer system, which none of the antiviruses detect because it's specially crafted. And he goes and pulls massive amounts of source code for Half-Life 2. Causes Half-Life 2 to be delayed for 6 months. Gamers get upset when their games get delayed, especially when Valve had to announce, hey, we have security, but you can go search this. Well, the guy was an idiot. He was very, very smart technically, but he was an idiot. He started bragging that he knew about it on an online forum. So now he had just about every Half-Life 2 player, or every Half-Life player who wanted to play Half-Life 2 on that forum, hunting him down. And they did find him, and he did get prosecuted. Do you have that kind of passion for your products? Where you have a million people wanting to let down a security issue? No. So when you have that kind of difference, that means you've got to protect. So there's 3 things I'm worried about. I'm worried about unauthorized data access. I'm worried about unauthorized data change. But one of the things that we probably don't do enough is I'm worried about unauthorized process change. What do I mean by that? So I see a couple of gray bears in here. How many of you remember the Superman with Richard Pryor? How many of you have seen the Superman with Richard Pryor? What did he do? Do you remember what he did? So Richard Pryor got hired as a system administrator over a mainframe system. And he was talking with his other folks in his organization, and he realized that their systems didn't keep very good track of the partial pennies. So he, having the access, modified the back-end code so all those partial pennies got accumulated and given to him. Well, when you start adding up partial pennies for a large organization, they're not pennies anymore. And he thought no one would catch on. They did when there was a huge amount of money missing from the system. But did anyone catch him before the processes ran? No, because who checks the processes? Something to think about. The places where it starts, where it ends up, but also as it's moving from where it starts to where it ends up. So let's start about places. Let's talk about web servers and services. How many of you are familiar with the SQL injection breaches that have happened over the last couple of weeks with regards to major national banks? Right? So there's one in Asia, was it Bangladesh? And then there's Qatar, right? One of our new allies in the Middle East. Their front-end apps were vulnerable to SQL injection. And as full-stack developers, I know you guys get beat down with making sure, hey, that the front-end app isn't vulnerable to SQL injection. How often do you test the back-end web services?
I have a question.
If
the DBAs make sure that there are no parameters, no calls from the front end, is called to a direct SQL. Everything should be a parameter SQL. SQL engine can be
nope.
avoided.
I can still beat that. Because there are techniques to beat that. And most of the time it doesn't revolve around stealing data. It revolves around turning your site into a waterfall. I'll give you a good example. All right? So maybe I can't steal back-end data, but maybe I can use an injection attack of some sort to ship something through that you can't detect. Right? And it shows as a parameterized query. It's not technically a SQL injection attack, but let's say that I take some JavaScript, and I obfuscate it with the functions I can use in JavaScript so that it's not human readable without the computer decrypting, right? Which means, regardless of the database system that you have, I can't build a trigger to check that code because I'm not going to build a JavaScript parser into my relational database platform. right? Oracle doesn't have a SQL Server, Postgres, MySQL. None of them have it because why would you build a JavaScript parser into your database platform? That's not what it does. So if you don't check that on the front end and reject it, then what's to stop me from obfuscating the code and sending you JavaScript that basically causes your website, because you allow elements to be inserted, especially in content management systems, that basically cause the user, they hit your page, to be affected by a 0 day, or maybe it's not even a 0 day, maybe it's a no vulnerability, but people don't always keep cache, and they go and ban you on their and what happens if it's on your corporate page, right? So I'll give you a good example. A few years ago, that happened to Forbes. Or actually, not a few years ago, it was only last year. So someone did an advertising, they injected code that showed up on Forbes, and it was specifically, the advertising was specifically purchased. And so they think it was an advanced persistent threat, someone, a nation state actor, because it was purchased to basically target Forbes at the time when most of your senior defense officials and senior federal government that deal with regulatory and financial stuff would log onto their computers and check the Forbes site. So somehow they had additional data research and they went after it. So SQL injection is still possible, not the way we traditionally think of it, but it's still possible. When you think about it, are they vulnerable? But also, what and who can connect to them? Are they secure, or because they're on the internal network, you consider them okay? And are you using HTTPS? And I'll get to a big reason why in a few minutes. What else is running on that same web server? True story, about 10 years ago, we had web hosting with the company, and we, of course, went cheap and did share services. Our websites weren't directly compromised. Someone else was running a component that was known to be weak, and some Turkish hacking group found it, just doing a simple scan, took over their website, and now allowed the privileged escape to be administrators, and suddenly I'm getting a call on Saturday when I'm supposed to have a soccer game with my kids, saying 20 of our websites have been fixed. Well, they had been. Our websites weren't directly hit. They were hit because someone else's stuff was on there. But if you've got multiple apps bundled on the same web server, is one of those apps vulnerable? If so, how do you, if it's vulnerable and it's not your app, then this is what makes it really worse. If it's not your app and it's vulnerable, doesn't it make your app vulnerable? Yeah, it actually does. What about file systems? How many of you process files at some point in your application? Excel spreadsheets, text files, XML documents, outputs from mainframe, output from one system to another. Who has the ability to modify those files? Who has the ability to read those? Because you know what? If your file system is weak, and your application code in your database is secure, why am I going to bang my head on the web servers, the fat clients, or the databases? Why waste my time? I'll just go up to the file server. And you know what? When I do pen testing, I usually start at the file system because I know that that's the place where most people don't protect. If you're talking about Windows system, they leave shares with everyone with full control because that's a default setting, or at least read, right? Well, if I'm talking about privacy data, all I care about is read. I don't want to modify the data. I just want to grab it if I'm an attacker because I can sell it. What processes can touch the file? And who controls those processes? And are you sure that those processes aren't being modified without your knowledge? Also, can you detect if the file's been tampered with? So let's say you get an extract from one system to another. Before you import it into the second system, can you detect if someone hand changes a few values? Maybe adjust the positive pay file so that they get a few extra bucks in their check. Well, not their check, into their account because you're doing that deposit. You know, how do you detect that? Can you detect that? Most organizations I know of have no systems in place for any of that stuff, even stuff like benefits and payroll. Think about that. With regards to databases, who can read the data? Who can modify it? And can you verify the data integrity? See, we spend a whole lot of time in audit on these two things, but you know what? This is hard. We don't do this well because this almost requires a custom solution for every application. But depending on the type of data that you're working with it may be absolutely critical. Now, some systems, like SQL Server, when you do encryption, they give you the option, if you're doing the built-in encryption, to basically specify just some set of values. And it can use the value. If you don't have that set of values, you can't decrypt, even if you have access to the right keys that were used to encrypt the data. And you can build that into those systems, but a lot of systems don't. You know, I see all kinds of ERP packages that are just wide open. They're built and designed with methodologies from the days when we didn't worry about attacks. Now, remember when I was talking about that in-flight? Is sensitive data being sent across the network? If your web servers aren't being protected by HTTP on the back end, because you say, hey, they're on the internal network, and therefore they're trusted. If there is sensitive data being sent over, maybe from your front end systems to your back end systems, if it's not encrypted, you've gone through all this trouble to make sure only the right people have access to the application. You've gone through all this trouble that whatever your data source is, whether you're dealing with a relational database or you're dealing with a NoSQL database or whatever it is that you're dealing with, that all those things, the permissions are right. But and so what that means is most of the time, if you've got true separation of duties, your networking guys don't have access to the application. They don't have access to the databases, right? But if the data is going across their network unencrypted, don't they have access to the data? Absolutely they do. Especially with the modern way that we handle networking and network troubleshooting. Most organizations that have the ability to go out and get a device like a Gigamon or anything like that, where all the network traffic gets dumped and stored, and we can replay conversations within a certain time period depending on how much storage we bought with that unit. Right? Some people can do it for a whole day, some people can do it for 30 days. They can replay any transaction. And if it's not encrypted, then and the problem is that you don't know that they're looking at the data for your system. See the problem? Now, if it isn't encrypted, how do you know that they're not watching? If you are encrypting, who controls the certificate authority that generates that certificate that you're using to encrypt? Right? Because in my organization, it's someone like me. Now the good news is I don't have access to the network system, so I can't take the certificate authority and grab the certificate and private key and go apply it to the networking stuff. But if they have it, that's a problem. All right, so let's put this into some real examples. So how many of you are familiar with SQL Server integration services? You want to work with it? All right, if you haven't, it's really simple. Because at the core, an SSIS package is an XML document. You guys work with those all the time, right? So what's special about SSIS? Only thing is that it has an executable, DTExec, that reads in that package, that document, whether it's stored on the file system or it's stored in a SQL server somewhere, and this is an XML document. It basically tells it how to build the .NET app to do the data transform or to do the data. That's all it does. Sound pretty familiar with some of the stuff that you guys do? Yeah. It's not a hard concept, right? I mean, it's used throughout. We call it different names. We brand it with our own, the companies brand it with their own names and everything else, and they make billions of dollars. But at the end of the day, it's the same stuff. The thing of it is that when you think about it, it's just an XML document. So if it's just an XML document, what does it take for me to modify it? What could you use to modify an XML document?
Emacs.
Emacs? Yeah, I'm a VI. Sorry. I really won't do that. So,
I gotta go. So.
yeah. So in the Windows world, what's the most popular thing that we use? Yeah. Any text editor will do. If you know what you're doing, you can even do it from the command line. Painful, but you can do it on the Windows side. But if I can update the package, then what's to stop me from adding another data connection if I understand how SSIS writes code? And you know what? Let me take it a step further. So SSIS, we now actually have a markup language called BIML. If you've seen anything that, what BIML does is it'll build the SSIS package for you. And it's markup language itself. So you use markup language to build a markup language document. It has some other features too, but BIML is actually produced by a company that's in Greenville, Veritas. but if I could modify the packages, maybe I add another data connection. So yeah, as it goes from this system to that system, all that privacy data goes across, but I'll add this little one that just kind of siphons it off until this little SQL server or this little whatever I have, Oracle or whatever I have stored off to the side. Maybe it's on a dev server that no one knows about, or no one realizes is there because I have admin rights and I install it. Right? How do you prevent that from happening? Because most of the time, we don't check for updates. How many of you, after you have deployed code, go back and routinely check if that code hasn't been changed in the deployed location? Right? So how do you know something didn't change it? Yeah, and when you start to think about those terms, you think about how hard it is to build systems. Now, there are products out there that can kind of do it, like there's Tripwire, which can tell me if a file has been changed, right? But those systems are expensive.